Hello all and welcome back to this new lecture on SQL for Data Science tutorial for absolute beginners. Today in this quick video we are going to cover having clause, and by the end of this video you will have a complete understanding that what is a having clause and how and why do we use it. As a prerequisite, you should have the basic understanding on group by. If you have not watched our explanation on group by yet, then I highly suggest that you watch that video first and then come back to this video. I am assuming that you are following this playlist in a sequence manner and hence you will not face any issues understanding this having clause. So without any further delay, let's proceed with the agenda. So having clause is used to apply filter on aggregated data. So once we do data aggregation using group by, after that we can use having clause in order to apply filters. It is very similar to where clause but for grouped or aggregated data. We will try to understand this better with a simple example. If you remember this example from previous video, this is a made up table and we tried to find out the average age from this table by using the average function, and we get this value with a single row and column. However, if we are concerned to know the average age for each respective gender, in that case we combine group by with our function in order to get this outcome. And now let's say that you want to apply a filter further on this output, and the condition should be that you want to get only those records where the average age is greater than equals to 27. In that case you need to understand that you cannot use a where clause because this average age is not a value coming from a single record or a single row. It is an aggregated value for this male category of gender. And in order to apply this kind of filtering on the aggregated data, we use having clause. So let's jump into our PG admin and connect with PostgreSQL in order to understand the correct syntax to use having clause. So I'm again using this payment table over here, which contains the information for each and every customer ID that has made a transaction. So it tells you that for each customer ID, through which staff ID, rental ID, and by what amount, on which date a particular transaction was made. And if we want to know the sum of amount for each customer ID, then we know that how can we do that using group by clause. So this will be the correct syntax to do that. All I'm doing is select customer ID, which I am using with the group by clause, and then for each customer ID I want to know the sum of amount from payment table. As simple as that. If I select this query and hit execute, I'll get to know the sum of amount against each and every customer ID. And let's say within this output I don't want to see the record for top 3 customer ID, which is 184, 87 and customer ID 477. In that case we can use a where clause, and I will tell you why. Because this information of customer ID belongs to each and every record. On each and every record you get to see a customer ID, and this is why you can use a where clause over here, because you are applying the condition on each and every record. So we can use this syntax over here which says select customer ID, and against each and every customer ID I want to know the sum of amount for respective customers from the payment table where the customer ID not in from these values, which means among these values I don't want to see these customer IDs in my output, and then group by customer ID. Remember, every time using a group by, the same column has to be there in the select statement as well. If you select this and execute, you will see the same output, but this time excluding the mentioned customer ID. So in such cases you can definitely apply the where clause. However, now let's try to understand where exactly we use having clause. We applied the where clause for customer ID because this information belonged to a specific record or row. Each and every row had this value of customer ID. However, this sum of amount information does not belong to any particular row or any particular record. This is an aggregated value against this customer ID, and against each and every customer ID we have this aggregated value that we can see within this sum of amount column. And if we want to apply a filter on this aggregated data, in that case we apply the having clause. Let's say I want to see those customer IDs having a sum of amount greater than a specific value. Let's go ahead and see how do we do that. So I'll comment it out and then I'll use this syntax. By the way, if you want to understand that how do I comment out a particular query, then all you need to do is select the query or statement and then press and hold the control key plus slash, and this is how the query will be commented out. And if you select and execute it, it will do nothing. And again, if you reverse it back, you can use it. And before using, let me give you a breakdown for this query that contains the having clause. So again, I'm using this group by against the customer ID column, and I'm selecting customer ID and the sum of amount against each customer ID from the payment table. But this time I want to filter out the data for only those customer ID having a sum of amount greater than 200. So if I select and execute it, I'll get only those records where the specific condition in the having clause is being satisfied. And this is why and how we use the having clause in SQL. Let's try to have another example in order to understand the having clause in a better way. Over here, I'm using the customer table from our DVD rental database that contains all these information. And let's say I want to group by this information by store ID. And against each and every store ID, I want to have a count of customer IDs. And then I will include only those records within the output where the store ID contains number of customer ID greater than a specific value. It is very easy to implement. Let's go ahead and see how do we do that. I will comment it out and I'm going to use this syntax. So I'm selecting the store ID, and against each and every store ID, I am taking the count of customer ID from customer table group by store ID. And again, pay attention, this store ID is common in the group by and select statement. And once I have this information, I want to include only those store ID having a count of customer ID greater than 300. Let's add a semicolon by the end in order to make SQL understand that this is the end of the query. I'll select it and hit execute. So we have only one store ID where the count was greater than 300. If we change this condition to 150, then the output will be changed as well. And this was another example of using having clause with SQL. So that is all for today's lecture. I hope that you were able to understand what is the use of a having clause and what is the correct way of using it. I hope you found this video helpful. If yes, please consider dropping a like below and subscribing to the channel. Also requesting you to let us know in the comment section if you are finding these tutorials helpful. If not, then also suggest us that how can we improve the tutorial quality. How can I improve my way of teaching, or if we need to improve the production quality? Each and every feedback from you will help us to come up with more quality tutorials going forward in the future. Thank you very much for your time. See you in the next lecture.